Rachel and her husband Dan had lived in their house for 6 years without a single strange thing happening in it. A normal 1990s build. Nothing old. Nothing with any history they were aware of when they bought it. They'd raised 2 kids in that house, hosted holidays in it, gone through the ordinary rhythm of a life without ever once feeling like the building itself was anything other than the backdrop to it. It was the kind of house you stop noticing after a while, because nothing about it ever gives you a reason to pay attention. It started small, the way these things usually do. About 8 months ago, Rachel woke up around 2 a.m. to a knocking sound coming from somewhere inside the house. 4 knocks, evenly spaced, followed by silence. She lay still in the dark, waiting to hear it again, telling herself it was probably a pipe, or the house settling the way houses do even when they're not particularly old. A few minutes passed, long enough that she'd almost drifted back towards sleep. Then it happened again. 4 knocks. The same rhythm, the same spacing, almost metronomic in how consistent it was, like something keeping deliberate time rather than a random structural noise. She woke Dan, and the 2 of them lay there together, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the hallway wall between their bedroom and the guest room, a shared wall with nothing behind it but insulation and the exterior siding of the house. No pipes ran through that section, according to the blueprints Dan pulled up on his phone, half out of curiosity and half hoping to find a mundane explanation before he let himself consider anything else. No electrical conduit either. Just insulation, drywall, and empty space. They got up and checked the guest room, checked the hallway, checked the attic access above that section of the house, moving methodically from one possible source to the next the way you do when you're trying to outlogic something, before it has the chance to actually scare you. Nothing. No loose panel, no branch against the siding, no obvious source for a sound that's specific and that rhythmic. It didn't happen again that first night after they checked everything, and for a few days, they almost let themselves believe it had been a one-time fluke, something explainable that simply hadn't repeated itself. It happened again 3 nights later, at almost the exact same time. Then twice the week after that. Always 4 knocks. Always from that same stretch of wall. They tried recording it on Dan's phone the 3rd time it happened, hoping to capture something they could send to a contractor or at least analyze themselves afterward. The recordings came out sounding exactly like what they'd heard live. For clean, evenly spaced knocks, picked up clearly enough on the phone's microphone that background noise wasn't a factor, but with nothing visually to go along with it beyond a dark hallway and a closed bedroom door. They started sleeping with a small baseball bat propped against the nightstand, not because either of them seriously believed a person was in their house, but because neither of them could think of anything else to do with the fear once it had nowhere left to go. Rachel and Dan eventually did something most people wouldn't have thought to try. They opened up a section of that wall to see what was actually behind it. What they found doesn't explain the knocking, but it's the reason this story ended up on this channel instead of getting quietly forgotten. Let's get into what happened when they went looking. Inside the wall. After nearly 2 months of the knocking continuing on and off, Dan finally decided to cut into the drywall himself, mostly out of frustration more than any real expectation of finding something. He picked the section of wall closest to where the sound always seemed loudest, cut a square opening with a drywall saw, and shined a flashlight into the gap between them. Studs. There was nothing dramatic inside. No hidden compartment. No obvious source of noise. Just insulation exactly where insulation should be. But wedged into the corner of that stud bay, pressed up against the exterior sheathing, was an old, water-damaged notebook, small enough to have slipped down from somewhere above during the original construction, or possibly during a renovation Dan and Rachel weren't aware of. The pages were mostly ruined, stuck together, illegible in most places. A few fragments of handwriting were still readable near the edges of some pages. A grocery list, part of what looked like a child's homework assignment, and on one page, mostly destroyed by moisture, a single legible line. "He keeps knocking on my door, and I don't answer anymore." They had no way to date the notebook definitively, and no way to connect it to any previous owner. The house had changed hands 3 times since it was built, and none of the earlier owners were listed with any contact information the couple could track down. Dan spent an evening trying to research the property's chain of ownership through county records anyway, mostly out of the same restless need for an answer that had driven him to cut into the wall in the first place. He found names, dates of sale, nothing more. No obituaries, no news stories, nothing that connected any previous resident to anything unusual. The trail simply ended in paperwork, the way most ordinary property histories do, offering no confirmation and no denial of whatever the notebook's fragment of a sentence had been describing. Dan patched the wall back up, notebook and all, because neither of them wanted to keep it in the house, and neither of them wanted to throw it away either. It felt, Rachel said, like it belonged exactly where they'd found it, sealed back into the same dark, quiet space it had apparently been sitting in for years, maybe decades, undisturbed until curiosity and frustration got the better of her husband on one particular Saturday afternoon. The knocking continued for another few weeks after that, then stopped entirely, and hasn't returned in the 4 months since. Rachel told me she still doesn't know what to make of that timing, whether finding the notebook actually resolved something, or whether it was simply a coincidence that happened to align with when it stopped. She said she doesn't think about it too hard, because she's not sure she wants an answer either way. A sound with no visible source is unsettling enough on its own, but our next story is about someone who could hear exactly what was making the noise, footstep by footstep, in a house where that shouldn't have been physically possible at all. Woman living alone, single-story home, Georgia. Denise had lived alone for almost 3 years in a small single-story ranch house. 1 level, no basement, no attic large enough to stand up in, nothing above her but roofline and insulation. It was a detail she mentioned specifically, because it matters for what happened. She'd bought the house herself after her divorce, a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood, and had genuinely come to love the routine of living alone, the quiet, the control over her own space, the simple fact of never having to negotiate the house with anyone else. One night around midnight, lying in bed reading before sleep, she heard footsteps. Distinctly upstairs, heavy, deliberate steps, moving in a straight line across what would have been a second floor if her house had one. Her first instinct, before her brain fully caught up with the layout of her own home, was the ordinary one. Someone's walking around upstairs. It took a full few seconds for that thought to collide with the reality that there was no upstairs to walk around in. She counted the footsteps without meaning to, the way your brain does with anything rhythmic and unexpected, holding perfectly still under the covers as though staying quiet might keep whatever was making them from noticing her in return. 14 footsteps, evenly paced, moving from one end of the house to the other, directly above her bedroom ceiling, and then stopping, all at once, the same way they'd started, abruptly, with no fading trail off the way real footsteps moving away with sound. She sat up immediately, heart pounding, running through the layout of her house in her head, trying to make the sound make sense. There was no second floor. There wasn't even a full attic, just a shallow crawl space above the ceiling joists, maybe 18 inches of clearance at its tallest point, nowhere close to enough room for a person to stand, let alone walk in a straight line, taking full, deliberate steps. She grabbed her phone and called a friend, staying on the line with her for almost 20 minutes while she worked up the nerve to check the house. She walked through every room, checked every window and door, confirmed everything was locked exactly as she'd left it. She got a step stool and pushed open the small attic access panel in her hallway ceiling, shining a flashlight up into the crawl space. Nothing. Just insulation, a few roof trusses, and the shallow, cramped space she already knew was there. No way in, no way out. No possible way for footsteps to have happened there at all. If you're still with me, that's not even the strangest part of Denise's story, because the footsteps didn't stop that night. And what she eventually figured out about the timing is the detail that convinced her something was actually happening, not just in her head. If a sound in your own house has ever kept you up at night, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm always looking for the next story like this. Here's the rest of what happened to Denise. The pattern? The footsteps came back 4 nights later. Then again the following week. Always the same count, 14 steps, evenly paced, moving in that same straight line above her ceiling. Always between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., a window narrow enough that after the 4th occurrence, Denise started keeping a written log, mostly to prove to herself she wasn't imagining a pattern that wasn't really there. It wasn't imagined. Every single instance fell within that 90-minute window, over the course of nearly 2 months. She brought in a contractor to inspect the crawl space more thoroughly, thinking maybe an animal, a large raccoon, and a possum, had somehow found its way in through a gap in the soffit vents and was moving around up there. The contractor spent almost an hour up in the crawl space with a headlamp, checking every vent, every seam in the roof decking, every possible entry point large enough for even a small animal to squeeze through. He found no entry point, no droppings, no nesting material, no insulation disturbed in any way that would suggest something had been moving through it repeatedly over a period of months. He told her, half joking but clearly a little unsettled himself by the end of the inspection, that the space was honestly too shallow and too cluttered with trusses for anything larger than a mouse to move through it in a straight line, let alone something heavy enough to produce the sound she was describing to him in detail before he'd gone up to check. He asked her, before he left, whether she was sure the sound was coming from directly above her bedroom rather than somewhere else in the house that might carry sound differently through the shared attic space. She told him she was certain. She'd tested it herself more than once, moving from room to room during a later occurrence, and the footsteps always tracked directly overhead no matter where in the house she stood to listen, moving in that same straight line regardless of her own position below it. Denise eventually did some research into the property's history and found, through county records, that a house had previously stood on that same lot decades earlier, a 2-story home that had burned down in a fire before her current single-story house was built in its place sometime in the 1980s. She has no way to confirm this connects to anything she experienced. She told me she brought it up mostly because it was the only detail she found that gave her any kind of frame to put around what was happening, even if it wasn't a real answer. The footsteps eventually became less frequent, tapering off over the following year until she stopped hearing them altogether. She still lives in that house. She told me she's made peace with not knowing, mostly because she didn't have another option, but that she still, almost automatically now, glances up at her ceiling sometimes around midnight, out of habit more than fear at this point. A knock with no source, and footsteps in a space too small for a person. Both strange, both unresolved. But the final story in this video is different from the first two in one very specific way. The sound didn't just happen near her. It said her name. And what she eventually discovered about where that voice was coming from is the reason this story closes out the video. Teenager home alone, apartment, Michigan. Alyssa was 17 and home alone on a Saturday afternoon, not even the middle of the night, which is part of what made this different from most stories like it. Her parents were out running errands. Her younger brother was at a friend's house, And she was alone in their apartment doing homework at the kitchen table with the TV on low in the next room for background noise. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable afternoon that makes what happened next feel even more out of place than if it had happened at 3 a.m. with all the usual atmosphere of fear already built in. She heard her name. Clearly. Not a mumble, not something that could be mistaken for the TV or a neighbor's voice carrying through the wall. Her actual first name, spoken once in a tone she described as flat and unhurried, coming from somewhere down the hallway toward the bedrooms. She said afterward that what struck her most, even in the first half second, was how ordinary the voice sounded. Not menacing, not distorted, just a voice saying her name the way anyone in her family might, which somehow made it worse once she realized nobody else was actually there to have said it. She turned the TV off immediately, sat completely still, and called out, asking if her brother had come home early. No answer. She checked her phone. No missed calls, no texts, nothing that would explain the voice. She walked down the hallway herself, checking her room, her parents' room, the bathroom, her brother's room, all of it empty exactly as she'd left it that morning. Nothing out of place, no window open, front door still locked from the inside. She sat back down at the kitchen table, telling herself it had been the TV after all. Some overlapping dialogue from whatever show had been playing that happened to sound like her name if she wasn't paying close attention. She'd almost convinced herself of that within about 10 minutes. Then she heard it again. Same hallway. Same flat, unhurried tone. Same name. This is the point where most people would have left the apartment immediately, and honestly, Alyssa considered it. What she did instead is what makes this story different from almost every other one I've covered. And it's exactly why this one closes out tonight's video. What she found. Instead of leaving, Alyssa did something she still can't fully explain the logic behind, other than telling me she felt, in the moment, like she needed to know rather than just needing to be safe. She got up, walked back down the hallway a second time, and this time, instead of just glancing into each room, she opened every closet, checked under every bed, and looked behind the shower curtain in the bathroom. Every possible hiding place in a two-bedroom apartment, methodically one at a time. She found nothing. No one. The apartment was exactly as empty as it had been the first time she checked. What she noticed on this second pass was something she'd missed the first time. A faint, intermittent buzzing sound coming from the hallway closet, low enough that she almost dismissed it as an appliance somewhere in the building. She opened the closet fully this time instead of just glancing inside, and found an old baby monitor unit, one half of a two-piece set, sitting on a high shelf where it had apparently been stored and forgotten for years, since well before her family had even moved into that apartment. It was, impossibly, still powered on, its small indicator light glowing faintly, picking up static and occasional garbled audio from some source neither she nor her parents could ever identify. No matching receiver unit anywhere in the apartment, no known previous tenant they could trace it back to, and, according to the manufacturer when her father called to ask, a battery type that model used which would have died and gone completely dead years before Alyssa was ever born, let alone still holding enough charge to power a working transmission signal. Her father took the unit apart that weekend, expecting to find some obvious explanation, a fresh battery someone had swapped in as a prank, a wiring modification, anything mundane. He found nothing unusual inside it at all, just old, corroded, non-functional components that, by any reasonable technical standard, should not have been capable of producing any sound whatsoever, let alone a clear, close-range voice repeating his daughter's name twice in one afternoon. He even called the manufacturer directly, reading off the model number and serial code, and was told the unit had been discontinued so long ago that the company barely had records of it, let alone any documented case of one still functioning without a working battery or a paired receiver anywhere nearby. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the unit could have somehow been picking up a signal from a different baby monitor entirely, one belonging to a neighbor using an overlapping frequency, which would at least explain a voice without explaining why it said his daughter's specific name. The representative told him that model used a frequency range that had been out of common production for well over 15 years, making that kind of crosstalk statistically almost impossible in a modern building, and increasingly unlikely the longer the unit had been sitting and used and untouched wherever it had come from. They threw the monitor away that same day, wrapped in a plastic bag at the bottom of the building's dumpster rather than the regular kitchen trash, which Alyssa's father later admitted was less about logic and more about wanting it gone from the apartment as completely and quickly as possible. Alyssa told me she still doesn't like being home alone in that apartment, even now, more than a year later, and that she's never again heard her name called out when no one else was there. She also told me she still doesn't fully believe the monitor is what she actually heard that day. She just doesn't have a better explanation, and neither does anyone else who's heard this story since.